Well, we wanted to begin today by getting back to a question that you had posed earlier. Like Sam, you had asked if this model could apply to short-term therapy. And I guess we would say that it depends on how short-term and who your general client population is and what the expectations and resources are of the client population that you're seeing. So in a general sense, however, we want to begin by saying that this model certainly can be used as a diagnostic tool in any kind of therapy, short or long term. And in many instances, it can be used in short-term therapy, but probably in a more modified way. So Sam, you were telling us earlier about a client you were seeing in brief therapy, where you began to apply some of the concepts from the model, and I think you told me that it really had an impact.
Yes, that would be good to help me think through it a little more. This was a young man, age 23, single and in graduate school. I've seen him for 5 sessions thus far. And he began this session by telling me about an incident that happened where he was frustrated with a classmate. And he was ready to simply write off the friendship. Apparently he had asked his friend to meet him for coffee to go over an assignment in a class they were taking together. And the friend said that he couldn't because he had to study for another class, but he said he'd be more than happy to meet up with him later in the same week. My client began our session by saying he was very disappointed about this, and this pushed him into a very depressive state almost immediately. Now, at prior points in his life, this client had occasional fleeting suicidal thoughts, and whenever he would experience any type of disappointment in relationships. So today he said that he was tired of being so affected by people and wanted to talk about how he could figure out a way to not let these situations get to him like this. Now, normally I would have immediately begun with a cognitive intervention to bring him some relief from his symptoms of depression. So just trying to help him problem solve ways that he could build up a larger social network. I connect this with how he wouldn't feel so vulnerable to rejection if he could call on more than one person whom he counted on as a friend, which is his overall pattern. My strategy would have been to try to change this outcome in order to alleviate and ultimately prevent disappointment and symptomatic reactions. This time I started thinking about the loyal waiting quadrant and the over-idealized self quadrant, and decided to explore whether any of these symptoms of depression stemmed from over-idealized expectations he had of others living up to his own standards.
Right. Good formulation. So tell us how you introduced this line of inquiry.
Well, I asked him to tell me the outcome of the initial phone conversation. I asked whether he followed up on his friend's offer, how he resolved his own disappointment. I remember thinking that I needed to slow things down and get as many details as I could. I was trying to practice moment-to-moment tracking. So.
Good. So can you tell us a little bit more about how the actual exchange unfolded between the two of you?
So he tells me that he did agree to meet for coffee a couple of days later. And I asked him, how was that for you? And he had a look of frustration or disgust on his face and said it was worthless. I remember thinking that this was a pretty extreme reaction. So I thought about his over-idealized standards and expectations of others. I would also say that he does have a family background where both of his parents would drop everything whenever he would have a need or request. Regardless of whether they were in the middle of something or not, they would stop what they were doing and respond to his requests. So then I thought about that continuum under each of the 4 quadrants. I asked him whether his expectations of others were being connected or in any other way measured against how his parents treated him. I wondered with him out loud if there were any other ways people could measure up in terms of proving that they cared about him. I asked if he could think about a continuum of care. We then began talking about what a 10 out of 10 would look like, what an 8 would look like, or what a 6 would look like on that continuum. My client started getting pretty excited, actually got into the exercise. After we identified some specifics about what other behaviors might look like further down the continuum, he was able to say, maybe someone's 8 for me is really their 10. Maybe this is all they can do or give. Maybe that's okay. Now, I know that some of this was working on a cognitive level, but I realized that the difference is that the line of questioning wasn't in the service of fixing or symptom relief. What was amazing for me about this guy is that he wasn't depressed at all after that. He actually said he felt better. He looked energized. But I don't know where to take it from here. I know that there is some stuff that is buried in Quadrant 4, but the guy never gets angry. He has had these over-idealized expectations, but where is the anger?
Okay. Well, first of all, let's just notice just how far you've come with this. You've been able to put together several different kinds of parts to create a whole, and you've already started to link up Quadrant 1 with Quadrant 3, in particular the loyal waiting of Quadrant 3, in this case waiting for others to meet his parents' standards. And by moving into the territory of relationships and loyal waiting, and how they connect, you gently suggest to him that it might be possible to have relationships and friendships without necessarily having to adhere to this perfectly idealized standard. Now, at some point, you might think about asking him what his parents said about this kind of thing, what kind of messages they would ever give to him about dealing with people outside family. How would they treat him? How would the parents expect it? How would he expect? How would the parents think that he's should be treated by people outside the family? But you might want to wait a bit longer about that, because this would also sort of threaten his sense of loyalty toward his family. I think for now you did just the right thing in entering Quadrant 3 in the manner that you did.
Great. Yeah. Also, do you notice how you are already sort of moving around the quadrants pretty organically?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I noticed that.
You knew that there was something that wasn't being said when you began to wonder about Quadrant 4, so you're beginning to anticipate some of what's coming next, or as the therapy unfolds. And you noticed that there was something unusual about having that level of idealization without any apparent manifestation of Quadrant 4, when that idealization kept being disappointed. So a good anticipation. But I would suggest that your patient maybe did reveal a bit of Quadrant 4 when you asked him how it felt to meet with his friend 2 days later. He said that the experience was worthless. So do you hear the devaluing that's contained in that statement? So yes, there's disappointment, but there was also more than disappointment. He was devaluing the experience because it didn't live up to his expectations, and to an extreme, by using the word worthless. In other words, if you don't live up to my standards and my parents' standards, you're worthless. So it leaks out just a little bit.
Wow, okay, you're right. Yeah, now I see it. Yep.
I see it.
But subtle, it's subtle. And then it disappears again.
Well, you know, there is such a thing as over-solicitous attention and care. You can begin to wonder for yourself, why did his parents have to drop everything every time he showed even the semblance of a need? What are they afraid of? What were they trying to protect? And how might this patient have picked up on their fears? Which may explain some of the shame that underlies his disappointment in people. For example, does he feel unworthy unless other people drop everything as a sign of proof that they care? Does he secretly believe that his parents thought he was fragile or inept?
Yeah. If a parent never lets you struggle to find your own answers, I mean, some of your own needs or delayed gratification, where is that child left? I mean, there's no chance to develop a sense of one's own mastery.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think you just described, and what we're hitting on is the difference between over-gratification and being given the right amount of gratification to let the authentic self emerge. So people can get stifled just as much by over-attention as under-attention,
Mm-hmm.
especially if the over-attention is coupled with anxiety on the part of the parents.
Right. All of what Patricia and I have been talking about is a cluster of questions that you would keep in the back of your mind for future harvesting in the therapy.
You know, I'm listening to all of this now, and I realize it has a great benefit in the short term. I mean, there may not be time for, you know, future harvesting, if you will, but you did provide a benefit in the short term to your clients, so who knows what kind of benefit that will be later on.
Right.
Some patients can use this in short-term therapy without doubt. If we penetrate sufficiently into the conscious, unconscious, syntonic, dystonic whole, and it's as if they recognize on some level that you see them, they're being seen, that you get the whole picture, even if you're only doing a small portion of the excavating.
Yeah.
Can we go back to the diagnostic piece for just a second? I was thinking about the fact that he brought up suicidality, and I jotted down a question so I wouldn't forget it. What does that say to us in terms of how far we go with the excavating if we know it's short-term work?
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, and some of what we have to keep in mind when we hear information like this is monitoring the pace of the therapy, keeping track of the pace, how much to be mindful of what we contain as well as open up.
Okay.
And we do both, and we have to be very mindful of that, especially under those circumstances. Now, if we can make inroads into the patient's level of extreme over-idealization, perhaps some of the tension associated with disappointment might be modulated, and therefore suicidal thoughts may diminish. It's difficult to know for sure, unless the patient comes back into therapy.
Okay. Thanks.
And I would predict that if this patient did come back into therapy, he would remember you and think to call you back. This is unlike many people who go from short-term therapist to short-term therapist. So it will have a lasting impact because, as Jack said, he really understood that you heard him. So I hear from people when they tell you about former therapists, yes, therapy was okay. It was supportive, but I wanted to try something different this time. And I guess what it boils down to is that if you understand what you're listening for in the patient's presentation on a dynamic level, you seeing all of the 4 quadrants simultaneously, it's, well, maybe we could say it's a little bit like doing laser therapy rather than using a scalpel.
You mean instead of using a Band-Aid, right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.